The day was as ordinary as any other for Edward, a man who had spent his retirement in quiet solitude. The air was thick with humidity as dark clouds rolled across the sky, threatening to burst. Edward, holding an umbrella in one hand and a small bag of groceries in the other, walked his usual route home, the familiar path offering little excitement or change. His joints ached with each step, a constant reminder of his age and the weight of time. But as he rounded the corner near his house, something caught his eye that shattered the monotony. There in the middle of the sidewalk stood a small figure, a girl no older than 8 or 9, her clothes soaked through from the rain that had now begun to pour in earnest. Her hair clung to her face, and her arms were wrapped around her tiny frame in a feeble attempt to stay warm. She wasn't crying, but her eyes reflected a sense of quiet despair that pulled at Edward's heart. For a moment, Edward stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The girl was alone, with no adult in sight. His instincts screamed caution. He had lived long enough to know the world was filled with those who would take advantage of the kindness of others. What if she was part of some scam, bait to lure in a kind stranger? But as he watched her shiver, his heart softened. She was just a child, and regardless of his doubts, she was clearly in need of help. The rain was coming down harder now, drenching everything in sight. Edward moved toward the girl, his steps slow and deliberate. "Are you all right, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice gruff but gentle. The girl didn't respond immediately, just glanced up at him with wide, frightened eyes. Her lips were turning blue from the cold, and Edward's heart clenched at the sight. Without thinking too much more, he found himself speaking again. "Come on, you can't stay out here in this weather. Let's get you inside where it's warm." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "I live just around the corner." The girl didn't move at first, but after a few more seconds of standing in the relentless downpour, she gave a small nod. Edward extended his hand, which she took with a tentative grip, her fingers icy against his. He held his umbrella over the both of them as they made their way to his small, modest house. His mind raced with questions, but he didn't ask any of them. Not yet. When they arrived, Edward unlocked the front door and ushered her inside. The warmth of his home enveloped them, a stark contrast to the biting cold outside. Edward quickly removed his wet coat and guided the girl toward the kitchen, where he placed his grocery bag on the counter. "Let's get you dried off," he muttered, grabbing a towel from a nearby drawer. The girl stood quietly, dripping water onto the tiled floor, as Edward gently draped the towel around her shoulders. "Sit down," he said, motioning to the small kitchen table. She obeyed, her movements slow and careful, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to make herself comfortable in such a place. Edward, now focused on warming her up, moved to the stove to heat some soup. As he worked, he stole glances at the girl, who sat silently at the table, clutching the towel around her small body. She was still shivering, but the warmth of the house seemed to be helping. Edward couldn't shake the feeling that there was something terribly wrong. Where were her parents? Why was she alone in such a storm? A part of him wanted to demand answers, to know what had happened to this child that left her in such a state. But another part of him, perhaps the wiser, older part, told him not to pry. The girl would speak when she was ready, and pushing her might only scare her off. After a few minutes, the soup was ready. Edward ladled it into a bowl and placed it in front of the girl, along with a slice of bread. "Eat," he said, his tone softer than before. "It'll warm you up." The girl hesitated for only a moment before picking up the spoon and starting to eat. She was hungry. Edward could tell by the way she devoured the food in front of her, though she was careful not to make a mess. He watched her, a strange feeling growing in his chest. It had been years since anyone had shared a meal with him in this house. Since his wife passed away, the silence had been both a comfort and a curse. But now, watching this small, quiet girl eat, something in him stirred, something long buried. When she finished, she looked up at Edward, her eyes filled with gratitude but still guarded. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Edward nodded, feeling awkward. "It's no trouble. You can stay here for a while if you need to." He paused, unsure of what to say next. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated again, then whispered, "Lily." "Lily," Edward repeated, nodding slowly. "Well, Lily, you're safe here." The silence between them stretched on for a moment, filled only by the sound of rain pounding against the windows. Edward could sense that Lily had been through something, but he still didn't ask. Instead, he simply watched her, seeing the vulnerability in her eyes. She looked like she hadn't had a proper home or care for a long time. His heart ached for her, and yet he couldn't shake the nagging fear in the back of his mind. Was he being too trusting? What if this was a mistake? But as he looked at the small, trembling figure in front of him, Edward made a decision. Whatever her story was, for tonight, she would have a roof over her head, a warm bed, and safety. He couldn't turn her away, not in this weather, not in her condition. "I'll set up the guest room for you," Edward said, getting up from his chair. Lily watched him with a mix of caution and relief as he moved down the hallway, opening the door to the small, rarely used guest room. It wasn't much, just a simple bed and a dresser, but it would do for now. "Come on," he called gently. Lily followed him down the hall, clutching the towel around her shoulders like a security blanket. When she saw the bed, her eyes widened slightly, but she said nothing. "You can sleep here," Edward said. "The bathroom's just down the hall if you need it." Lily stood in the doorway for a moment, as if unsure whether she should step inside. Then slowly, she walked over to the bed and sat down on the edge, her small frame barely making a dent in the mattress. Edward watched her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Get some rest. We'll figure things out in the morning." Lily looked up at him, her expression softening just a little. "Good night," she whispered. "Good night," Edward replied, closing the door gently behind him. As he made his way back to the living room, Edward felt a strange sense of contentment wash over him. For the first time in years, his home didn't feel quite so empty. The rain continued to fall steadily, tapping against the windows of Edward's small, quiet home. The night felt unusually still, and the house, once so empty and cold, now held a warmth that Edward couldn't quite place. He sat in his favorite armchair, the one that had become his retreat over the years, sipping a cup of tea and listening to the distant hum of the rain. His thoughts drifted back to the little girl, Lily, who was now tucked away in the guest room. The memory of her small, shivering frame and those wide, frightened eyes lingered with him. He hadn't asked her many questions, and she hadn't offered any answers. But there was something about her, something in the way she carried herself, that unsettled and intrigued him. Despite her clear vulnerability, she seemed to possess a quiet strength, a resilience that was unusual for someone so young. After setting up her room, Edward had expected Lily to lie down and rest, but she had surprised him. Instead of retreating to the bed, she had come back to the kitchen, moving with deliberate care. She took the dishes from their meal, still sitting in the sink, and began to wash them. Her small hands worked methodically, scrubbing each plate and cup with precision. Edward had watched from the doorway, too stunned to speak. He wasn't used to such gestures. For years, his home had been a space of solitary routines. No one had shared his burdens. No one had stepped in to help. Yet here was this child, a stranger, taking it upon herself to tidy up his kitchen as if it were her own. He had opened his mouth to tell her to stop, that it wasn't necessary, but the words never came. Instead, he stood in silence, watching as Lily carefully dried each dish and placed them back in their proper place. There was a gracefulness in her actions, a sort of quiet dignity that both impressed and bewildered him. When she finished, Lily turned toward him, her face still mostly unreadable, but softer somehow. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod before moving back toward her room. Edward watched her retreating figure, feeling a strange mixture of emotions that he couldn't quite explain. This girl, this small, rain-soaked child, had entered his life only hours ago, and yet already his home felt different. As the night went on, Edward found himself sitting in the dim light of his living room, reflecting on the events of the day. His home had always been a sanctuary for him, a place to retreat from the world. Since his wife passed away, it had become more of a shell, a quiet fortress where he could shut out the noise and the mess of life. He had grown used to the silence, to the routine, and to the predictable solitude. But now, with Lily's quiet presence in the house, the silence no longer felt like comfort. It felt like something was missing, something he hadn't realized he needed until she arrived. He thought about the rain still falling outside, and how he had almost walked past her without stopping. His instinct had been to keep moving, to mind his own business. He wasn't a man given to grand gestures of kindness or to inserting himself into other people's lives. But there had been something about Lily, something in the way she had stood there, soaking wet, eyes wide but uncomplaining, that had stirred something in him. A long dormant part of his heart had urged him to help her, to give her shelter, even if only for the night. Edward rose from his chair, feeling the stiffness in his joints as he walked toward the hallway. The light beneath the door of the guest room was dim, but it was still on, casting a faint glow through the crack. He hesitated for a moment, wondering if he should check on her, but then decided against it. She had her privacy, and he didn't want to intrude. He made his way back to the kitchen, where he found everything perfectly in order. The countertops were wiped clean, the dishes stacked neatly, and even the chairs had been pushed back into place. The room, usually cluttered with remnants of his solitary meals, was now spotless. Edward felt a strange sense of both guilt and gratitude as he looked around. This child, who had nothing and was in such obvious need, had come into his home and taken care of it as though it were her own. What had driven her to do this? What kind of life had she led that made her feel responsible for cleaning a stranger's house? As he stood there, contemplating these questions, Edward's mind began to wander back to his own past. Memories of his younger days, of raising his own family, of the warmth and chaos that used to fill his home, crept into his thoughts. He hadn't always been so alone. There had been a time when his life was full of love, full of noise, full of the small, everyday moments that made life feel rich and meaningful. But time had a way of erasing those moments. His children had grown up and moved away, their lives pulling them in different directions. His wife's passing had been the final blow, leaving him in a quiet house that no longer felt like a home. Over the years, Edward had grown used to the stillness, to the predictable monotony of his days. He had told himself that this was just how life was now, that this was the natural course of aging. Yet tonight, with Lily's presence lingering in the air, Edward found himself questioning that belief. For the first time in a long time, his house felt alive again. The silence wasn't oppressive, it was filled with possibility. Lily's simple act of cleaning, of taking care of something, had breathed life into a home that had long been neglected. He found himself pacing the kitchen, his thoughts swirling. What was this girl's story? Why had she been out there alone in the rain? Where were her parents? He hadn't pressed her for answers, but now he wished he had. There was a mystery to her, a weight to her silence that spoke of something deeper, something hidden. As the hours passed, Edward felt a growing connection to Lily, a connection that didn't need words to be understood. Her quiet presence had touched something in him, something he hadn't realized was still there. He had spent so many years shutting himself off from the world, convinced that he didn't need anyone, that his life was complete in its solitude. But now, with Lily in his home, he felt the faint stirrings of something different. Edward finally returned to his chair, the weight of the day settling in his bones. He glanced toward the guest room once more, a sense of calm washing over him. He didn't know what the future held for Lily, or for him, but he knew one thing: tonight had changed something. It had opened a door he hadn't even realized was closed. The rain outside had slowed to a gentle drizzle, the night air cool and still. As Edward closed his eyes, ready to surrender to sleep, he thought about the bond that had formed between him and the little girl. It wasn't one of words or grand gestures, but something quieter, deeper, a connection forged in silence, in small acts of kindness, and in the shared experience of simply being together. For the first time in years, Edward didn't feel quite so alone, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to hope. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Edward's modest living room, casting soft streaks of light on the worn-out furniture. Edward, now accustomed to his quiet and solitary mornings, awoke with an uneasy feeling. His mind kept drifting back to the little girl, Lily, who had silently entered his life the day before. As he sipped his tea, doubt gnawed at him. Did I do the right thing by letting her stay? He thought, recalling the vulnerability in her eyes when he saw her in the rain. Still, fear lingered. He couldn't shake the irrational thought that when he returned from his morning errand, he might find his house ransacked, his belongings missing. Years of living alone had made him cynical, distrusting of the world outside his door. But she had been so small, so fragile, Edward reminded himself. Surely a child like her couldn't cause any harm. Still, the fear remained. After all, Edward had seen the darker sides of life during his long years, and he knew the harsh realities that desperation could create. He prepared himself mentally for disappointment, ready to accept that maybe, just maybe, his instincts had been wrong about her. Pulling on his coat, Edward stepped outside into the brisk morning air. The rain from the previous night had left the streets damp, the scent of wet earth hanging in the air. He glanced at his house one last time before setting off toward the corner store. His mind raced as he wandered down the familiar street, replaying the events of the previous night over and over in his head. The girl had said so little, but her silence had spoken volumes. She was cautious, even timid, but her presence had somehow filled the empty space in Edward's home. He hadn't expected that, especially after all the years of loneliness. There was something haunting in her quietness, something that mirrored the solitude he had known for too long. At the store, Edward purchased the usual: bread, some milk, and a few extra things to get him through the next few days. He exchanged the usual pleasantries with the shopkeeper, but noticed that he wasn't as talkative as he usually was. His mind was elsewhere, occupied by thoughts of what might await him when he returned. He couldn't help but imagine the worst. By the time Edward made it back to his house, his heart was pounding with anxiety. He hesitated at the front door, feeling the familiar weight of his doubts and fears pressing down on him. Taking a deep breath, he unlocked the door and pushed it open, bracing himself for disappointment. But what greeted him was something entirely unexpected. The moment Edward stepped inside, he was stunned. His once cluttered, dusty living room had been transformed. The floors, which had been neglected for far too long, now gleamed with cleanliness. The dull, worn-out furniture had been carefully dusted, and every surface sparkled as if it had been touched by a skilled hand. Even the windows, which had once been streaked with dirt and grime, were now crystal clear, allowing the sunlight to pour in without obstruction. Edward stood frozen in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. He placed the grocery bags on the floor, his eyes wide with disbelief as he slowly walked deeper into the house. The change was not just cosmetic. It was as though someone had breathed life into his once lifeless home. In the kitchen, the transformation was even more dramatic. The dishes that had been piling up in the sink for days were now washed, dried, and neatly stacked in the cupboard. The counters, once cluttered with crumbs and old newspapers, were spotless. The dull, worn tiles of the kitchen floor had been scrubbed clean, and even the air seemed fresher. He wandered into the small dining room, still in a daze. The old oak table, which had been buried beneath a mountain of letters, receipts, and unopened bills, was now clear, polished to a high shine. The chairs were neatly pushed in, and even the curtains, which had sagged with dust, appeared to have been shaken out and rehung. It was as though someone had come in and given his house, and his life, a new beginning. Edward's mind raced. How had she done this? How had a child, barely old enough to take care of herself, managed to transform his entire home in just a few short hours? And why? Why had she taken it upon herself to clean a house that wasn't hers, for a man she hardly knew? He felt an overwhelming sense of guilt wash over him. All the doubts and suspicions he had carried with him, about her intentions, now seemed so small and petty. He had expected the worst, braced himself for disappointment, but instead he had been shown an act of kindness so pure, so unexpected, that it left him speechless. Still reeling from the shock of what he had seen, Edward made his way to the back door, his eyes drawn to the garden outside. It had been years since he had done any meaningful work out there. The weeds had taken over long ago, choking out the flowers and turning the once beautiful garden into a wild, overgrown mess. But now, as he gazed out the window, he saw something that took his breath away. The garden, too, had been transformed. The weeds had been pulled, the flower beds carefully tended to, and the overgrown bushes trimmed back. Even the small vegetable patch, which Edward had abandoned years ago, had been cleared and restored to its former glory. The sight of it brought a lump to his throat. He stepped outside, his feet crunching on the newly swept path. The air was cool and crisp, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Edward felt a sense of peace settle over him. He stood there, surrounded by the quiet beauty of his garden, feeling the warmth of the sun on his face. As he looked around, he realized something profound. This wasn't just about a clean house or a tidy garden. This was about something deeper. It was about trust, about kindness, about the connections we make with others, even when we least expect it. Edward felt the weight of his doubts lift, replaced by a deep sense of gratitude. He had doubted her, assumed the worst, because that's what life had taught him to expect. But this little girl, who had so little herself, had shown him a kindness he hadn't even known he needed. Tears welled up in his eyes as he stood there, overwhelmed by the enormity of what had just happened. This wasn't just a clean house. It was a reminder that the world, despite all its hardships, still had room for acts of kindness, for unexpected blessings, for moments of grace. And in that moment, Edward realized that the greatest gift this little girl had given him wasn't a spotless home. It was the gift of hope. Edward sat in his worn armchair, his eyes fixed on the little girl who had transformed not only his house but his life in just a matter of hours. The soft light of late afternoon streamed through the freshly cleaned windows, casting a warm glow over the room. Everything around him felt different now, brighter, more alive, and yet his heart was heavy with a decision he hadn't anticipated needing to make. Lily, the little girl, sat across from him, her small frame perched quietly on the edge of the chair. Her wide, innocent eyes glanced around the room as if she too was silently taking stock of all the changes. Edward knew she had nowhere to go, no one waiting for her, and the thought tugged at something deep inside him. He couldn't ignore the growing sense of responsibility he felt toward her. The silence in the room was thick, filled with unspoken thoughts and emotions. Edward cleared his throat, trying to find the words to say, but nothing came easily. He watched as Lily folded her small hands in her lap, looking down at the floor. She was clearly preparing herself for whatever was to come next, whether it was a kind word or an order to leave. Edward leaned forward in his chair, feeling the weight of the moment press down on him. His mind raced, thinking about the long, lonely years he had spent in this house. The isolation had been his companion for so long that he hadn't even realized how empty his life had become. But now, in the presence of this small, quiet girl, everything felt different. "You don't have to go, you know," Edward said softly, his voice trembling slightly. Lily looked up at him, her wide eyes searching his face for an explanation. She remained silent, waiting for him to continue. "I mean, I don't want you to go," Edward clarified, his voice stronger now. "You've brought something into this house that I didn't even know I was missing. It's been so long since I've had anyone around." The girl blinked at him, her expression still one of quiet caution, as if she didn't dare believe what she was hearing. She had spent her short life learning not to trust easily, not to expect kindness, because too often it hadn't been given. Edward sat back in his chair, rubbing his hands together as he tried to find the right words. "I was wrong to doubt you," he admitted. "When I left this morning, I wasn't sure if I'd come back to find this house, empty or worse. But you've done more than I could have ever asked. You've given me something I didn't even know I needed." Lily continued to watch him, her small face serious but softening at his words. Edward could see the tension in her shoulders ease, just a little, as if she was beginning to understand that something important was happening between them. "I know you've been through a lot," Edward continued. "I don't know what brought you here or why you were out there in the rain, but you don't have to keep running. Not anymore." The room seemed to hold its breath as Edward's words lingered in the air. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and the only sound was the faint ticking of the old clock on the mantel. Edward could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the enormity of what he was about to offer weighing heavily on him. It wasn't a decision he had made lightly, but it was one he felt deeply in his bones. "Lily," he said quietly, his voice full of warmth, "I want you to stay. With me. I want to give you a home." The little girl's eyes widened, and for the first time since she had entered his life, Edward saw the faint flicker of hope in her expression. It was as if she had spent so long in survival mode that the idea of someone offering her a home, a real home, was almost too much to comprehend. "You don't have to be alone anymore," Edward added, his voice thick with emotion. "And neither do I." Lily's lip quivered, but she remained silent, her hands clutching the edge of her seat as if she were afraid to let go. Edward could see the struggle in her eyes, the battle between hope and fear. She had been let down before, abandoned by those who were supposed to care for her. The walls she had built to protect herself were still there, but Edward could see them beginning to crack. "I can't promise I'll be perfect," Edward said, his voice faltering slightly. "I'm an old man and I've made my share of mistakes. But I can promise you this. I'll do everything I can to make sure you're safe, to make sure you're cared for." The words hung in the air like a fragile promise, one that Edward hoped with all his heart she would accept. For a long moment, Lily didn't move. Edward's heart ached as he watched her wrestle with her emotions, unsure if she would trust him, unsure if he had done enough to convince her that he truly meant what he said. He could see the vulnerability in her eyes, the fear of being hurt again. And then, slowly, Lily nodded. It was a small, tentative movement, but it was enough to send a wave of relief washing over Edward. His heart swelled with emotion, and for the first time in years, he felt tears pricking at the corners of his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Lily looked at him with those wide, soulful eyes, and for the first time since they had met, she spoke. I didn't mean to cause trouble," she said softly, her voice trembling. "I didn't know where else to go." Edward shook his head, a gentle smile spreading across his face. "You haven't caused any trouble, Lily. Not at all. In fact, you've done the opposite. You've brought something back into my life that I thought I'd lost a long time ago." The girl's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, her small hands trembling. "I didn't think anyone would ever want me," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Edward's heart broke at her words, and he felt a surge of protectiveness wash over him. "I want you," he said firmly, his voice steady now. "I want you to stay with me, if that's what you want. We'll figure it out together." Lily's lip trembled again, but this time, she didn't hold back the tears. They spilled down her cheeks, and Edward reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her small frame shaking with quiet sobs. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the past few days catching up with them both. But it wasn't a heavy silence. It was a silence filled with understanding, with the beginning of something new. Edward knew that this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. There would be challenges ahead, of that he was certain. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel afraid. He didn't feel alone. As Lily's tears subsided, she wiped her eyes and looked up at Edward with a small, shy smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Edward smiled back, his heart full. "No, Lily," he said softly. "Thank you." And in that moment, both of them knew that they had found something in each other, something they had both been missing for far too long. A family. Lily had come to Edward's door out of the rain, cold, hungry, and alone. But now, as she sat by his side, the warmth of their connection filled the house. Edward, the elderly pensioner who had thought his life was over, had found new purpose, new meaning. And Lily, the little girl who had been lost and forgotten by the world, had found a home. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more like it, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the story and share any themes or ideas you'd like to hear in future stories. Your feedback means the world to me. Thanks for watching.